In the depths of Kensington Palace, where shadows dance between centuries of secrets, a single locked door has remained untouched for 15 years. Behind its mahogany panels lies a room that time forgot, a nursery preserved exactly as it was left, filled with treasures that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. When palace guard Thomas Mitchell discovers a hidden key during a routine security check, he unwittingly opens a gateway to a mystery that has haunted the royal family for over a decade. What he finds inside will challenge everything the world believes about the beloved late Princess Eleanor and reveal why her sister-in-law Catherine has guarded this room's secrets with her life. Some doors are meant to stay locked forever. Some truths are too dangerous to reveal, but when the past refuses to stay buried, even the most carefully constructed lies begin to crumble. The sealed nursery holds more than memories. It holds the power to rewrite history itself. Thomas Mitchell had walked the corridors of Kensington Palace for 7 years, but he had never noticed the small brass key tucked behind the ornate picture frame in the East Wing. It was only when he was conducting his monthly security inspection that the frame shifted slightly, revealing the tarnished metal hidden in the shadows. The key was old, older than anything he had seen in the palace's everyday use, with an intricate pattern etched into its head that seemed to match the elaborate door handles found in the oldest sections of the royal residence. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the autumn light filtered weakly through the tall windows of the palace corridors. Thomas had been examining the security of various rooms when he noticed that one particular door, painted the same cream color as all the others, bore no nameplate or identification. It stood at the end of a hallway that seemed somehow forgotten, where the carpet was slightly more worn and the wallpaper showed faint signs of age that the palace's usual meticulous maintenance had somehow overlooked. As he approached the door, Thomas realized he had never seen anyone enter or leave this room in all his years of service. The brass handle was different from the others, more elaborate with the same intricate pattern he had noticed on the mysterious key. His curiosity piqued, he tried the handle and found it locked. This was unusual in itself, as most palace doors remained unlocked during daytime hours to allow easy access for staff and maintenance crews. Thomas examined the lock more closely and noticed that it was not a modern mechanism but an older style that would require a specific key. The realization struck him immediately. The key behind the picture frame might be intended for this very door. He retrieved it and found that it fit perfectly into the lock. With a slight turn, he heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place, and the door opened with a barely audible creak. What lay beyond the threshold took his breath away. The room was a nursery, but not just any nursery. This was a space that seemed to exist outside of time, preserved with an almost sacred care that spoke of deep love and profound loss. The walls were painted in soft pastels with hand-painted murals of fairy tale characters dancing across the surfaces. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been carefully cleaned and maintained despite the room's apparent abandonment, casting golden patches across a collection of toys that seemed to be waiting patiently for small hands to return to them. The nursery was not dusty or neglected, as Thomas might have expected from a forgotten room. Instead, it was pristine, as if someone had been caring for it regularly, ensuring that every detail remained perfect. A rocking horse sat in one corner, its painted eyes bright and alert, its saddle polished to a soft shine. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books whose spines showed gentle wear from repeated reading, and toys that ranged from simple wooden blocks to elaborate dollhouses that must have cost more than Thomas earned in several months. In the center of the room stood an ornate crib, carved from what appeared to be mahogany and decorated with intricate designs that spoke of royal craftsmanship. The bedding was white and pristine, with delicate embroidery along the edges that depicted small crowns and roses intertwined in an elegant pattern. Next to the crib was a comfortable armchair positioned perfectly for someone to sit and watch over a sleeping child. And beside it, a small table held a collection of items that seemed intensely personal. Thomas approached the table with growing fascination and concern. Upon it lay a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth from handling alongside several photographs in silver frames. The photograph showed a woman he recognized immediately, Princess Eleanor, the beloved former member of the royal family who had died in a car accident 15 years earlier. But these were not the formal portraits he had seen in newspapers and official publications. These were intimate family photos, showing Eleanor in casual moments laughing with someone just outside the frame, holding a small child or sitting in the very chair that now stood empty beside the crib. The journal drew his attention like a magnet. Thomas knew he should not touch it, should not intrude upon what was clearly a private space, but something about the room compelled him to understand its purpose. He opened the cover carefully and found page after page of handwriting in elegant script. The entries were dated beginning nearly 16 years ago, and as he read the first few lines, he realized he was looking at the private thoughts of Princess Eleanor herself. The early entries spoke of joy and anticipation, of preparations for a child who would bring new happiness to the royal family. Eleanor wrote about choosing colors for the nursery, about the excitement of feeling the baby's first movements, and about dreams for the future that stretched ahead like a golden path. Her words painted a picture of a woman deeply in love with life and looking forward to motherhood with every fiber of her being. But as Thomas read further, the tone of the entries began to change. Eleanor began writing about concerns, about pressures from within the royal family, and about decisions being made on her behalf that she did not agree with. She mentioned meetings with palace officials, discussions about the baby's future that seemed to exclude her voice, and a growing sense that she was losing control over her own life and the life of her unborn child. One entry, written just weeks before Eleanor's death, spoke of a plan that had been put into motion without her knowledge. She had discovered that arrangements were being made for her child's future that went far beyond the normal protocols for royal births. There were mentions of documents being prepared, of secret meetings between high-ranking officials, and of a decision that would ensure her child's safety but would require sacrifices she was not sure she could make. The final entry in the journal was dated just 3 days before Eleanor's fatal accident. In it, she wrote about having made a choice that would protect her child but would require her to disappear from their life entirely. She spoke of Catherine, her brother's wife, who had agreed to help implement a plan that would keep the child safe from forces within the royal establishment that Eleanor had come to fear. The entry ended with a promise to her unborn child that someday, when it was safe, the truth would be revealed and they would be reunited. Thomas closed the journal with trembling hands, his mind reeling from the implications of what he had read. If Eleanor's words were true, then the official story of her death and her childless state was a fabrication designed to protect a secret that went to the very heart of the royal family. He looked around the nursery with new eyes, seeing not just a preserved memorial to a lost princess, but evidence of a conspiracy that had been maintained for 15 years. His attention was drawn to a wardrobe that stood against the far wall. Unlike the other furniture in the room, this piece seemed more recent, as if it had been added after the nursery's initial creation. Thomas opened its doors and found it filled with clothes in various sizes, from newborn garments to items that would fit a teenager. Each piece was carefully arranged and appeared to have been worn, suggesting that this nursery had not been simply preserved as a shrine, but had been actively used over the years. Among the clothes, Thomas found a small wooden box tucked into the back corner of the wardrobe. Inside were more photographs, these showing a child at various ages, always photographed in locations that seemed familiar yet somehow removed from the main areas of the palace. The child's face bore a striking resemblance to Princess Eleanor, with the same bright eyes and gentle smile that had made her so beloved by the public. As Thomas studied the photographs, he began to piece together a story that challenged everything he thought he knew about the royal family. It seemed that Eleanor's child had not perished with her, as the world believed, but had been secretly raised within the palace walls, hidden from public view but carefully tended by someone who had access to this sealed nursery. The evidence suggested that Catherine, now one of the most prominent members of the royal family, had been involved in this deception from the beginning. The implications were staggering. If a child of Princess Eleanor's bloodline existed and had been hidden away for 15 years, the line of succession could be affected. More importantly, The public had a right to know that Eleanor had not died childless and alone, but had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect her offspring from unknown dangers within the very institution she had married into. Thomas realized he was standing at the center of a mystery that could shake the monarchy to its foundations. The sealed nursery was not just a memorial to a lost princess, but a repository of evidence that could rewrite recent royal history. As he carefully returned the journal and photographs to their places, he knew that his discovery would change everything, not just for the royal family, but for himself as well. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade as Thomas locked the nursery door behind him, but he knew he would return. The secrets contained within that room demanded answers, and he was perhaps the only person outside of the conspiracy who now knew they existed. As he walked back through the palace corridors, the brass key felt heavy in his pocket, weighted with the responsibility of the truth it had unlocked. Little did Thomas know that his discovery had not gone unnoticed. Security cameras throughout the palace had recorded his movements, and by evening, certain members of the royal household would know that the sealed nursery had been breached for the first time in months. The carefully maintained secret that had protected a hidden child for 15 years was about to face its greatest threat, and the consequences would reach far beyond the walls of Kensington Palace. The game had changed, and Thomas Mitchell, a simple palace guard who had stumbled upon a brass key, had become an unwitting player in a drama that had been unfolding in the shadows for over a decade. The sealed nursery had given up its first secret, but many more lay waiting to be discovered, and each one would prove more dangerous than the last. Catherine Whitmore had always prided herself on her ability to maintain composure under pressure, but the call she received at 3 a.m. tested even her considerable self-control. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Webb, the palace's head of security, and his words cut through the darkness of her bedroom like a knife through silk. "Your Highness," Marcus said, his usual calm demeanor strained, "we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. The East Wing nursery has been accessed." Catherine sat up in bed, her heart immediately beginning to race despite her outward calm. She had been expecting this call for 15 years, knowing that someday, somehow, the carefully constructed barriers around their secret would be breached. "Who?" she asked simply. "Thomas Mitchell, one of our guards. He found the key during a routine inspection and used it to enter the room. Our cameras show he spent approximately 45 minutes inside, and he examined several items of significance." Catherine closed her eyes, her mind already racing through the implications and the necessary responses. Thomas Mitchell was a good man. She knew that much from his personnel file, but good men could still pose dangers when they stumbled into situations beyond their understanding. What exactly did he see? The journal, the photographs, the wardrobe contents? "Everything, Your Highness." The words hit Catherine like physical blows. After 15 years of successfully maintaining the secret, a single curious guard had undone all their careful work in less than an hour. She thought of Eleanor, of the promises they had made to each other in those final desperate weeks before the accident, and of the child whose safety had depended on their ability to keep the truth hidden. "I'll be there in an hour," Catherine said. "Have Thomas brought to the blue sitting room, but do not tell him why. Make sure no one else knows about this breach until I can assess the situation fully." As she dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, Catherine's mind traveled back to the events that had led to this moment. She remembered Eleanor's growing paranoia in the months before her death, her sister-in-law's increasing conviction that forces within the royal establishment were working against her and her unborn child. At first, Catherine had dismissed Eleanor's concerns as pregnancy-induced anxiety, but as time passed, she had begun to see the truth in Eleanor's fears. The royal family was an institution that valued stability above all else, and Eleanor's child represented a potential disruption to carefully laid plans that stretched decades into the future. There were those within the palace who viewed the pregnancy as an unwelcome complication, and Eleanor had discovered evidence that arrangements were being made to ensure the child would never pose a threat to the established order. Catherine arrived at the palace as the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The building seemed different in the early morning hours, more mysterious and somehow more alive. as if the shadows held secrets that daylight would chase away. She made her way to the blue sitting room, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty corridors, and found Thomas Mitchell waiting for her with an expression that mixed confusion, fear, and determination. Thomas rose as she entered, offering the respectful bow that protocol demanded, but his eyes held a directness that told Catherine he would not be easily dismissed or intimidated. She had dealt with many people over the years who had stumbled across information they should not have possessed, and she had learned to read their intentions quickly. Thomas, she realized, was not motivated by greed or ambition, but by a genuine desire to understand the truth. "Please sit down, Thomas," Catherine said, settling into the chair across from him. "I understand you made an interesting discovery yesterday." Thomas nodded slowly. "I found a room, Your Highness, a nursery that has been kept locked and hidden." Inside were things that suggest Princess Eleanor did not die childless, as the world believes. Catherine studied his face carefully. "That is a very serious accusation, Thomas. Are you certain about what you think you saw?" "I saw her journal, her photographs, clothes for a child of various ages, and evidence that someone has been caring for that room regularly for 15 years. Unless I am very much mistaken, Princess Eleanor's child survived and has been secretly raised within these walls." The directness of his statement impressed Catherine despite the gravity of the situation. Thomas was not trying to dance around the truth or negotiate for personal advantage. He simply wanted answers, and she found herself respecting his honesty even as she recognized the danger it represented. "What you discovered," Catherine said carefully, "is indeed connected to Princess Eleanor, but the full truth is more complicated than you might imagine. If I were to tell you that story, would you be prepared to hear something that might change your understanding of this family and your place within it?" Thomas considered her words for a long moment. "I believe I already understand that my place here has changed simply by opening that door. But yes, Your Highness, I would like to hear the truth." Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds where early morning staff were beginning their daily routines. "Eleanor was not paranoid," she began. "Her fears about threats to her child were well-founded. There were indeed members of the royal establishment who viewed her pregnancy as problematic, and plans were being made to ensure that the child would never be able to claim any rights or recognition." She turned back to face Thomas. "Eleanor discovered these plans approximately 6 weeks before her death. She came to me because she knew that my position within the family was secure enough that I might be able to help her protect her child from those who would do harm. Together, we developed a strategy that would ensure the child's survival, but it required Eleanor to make the ultimate sacrifice." Thomas leaned forward, his attention completely focused on her words. "The car accident was not an accident?" "The car accident was exactly what it appeared to be," Catherine replied. "Eleanor died in that crash, and her death was a genuine tragedy that devastated all of us. But what the world does not know is that her child had been born 3 weeks earlier, in complete secrecy, and was already safe within these walls when Eleanor lost her life." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had expected to hear about secret adoptions or hidden pregnancies, but the reality was both simpler and more complex than anything he had imagined. The child lived? The child lived and continues to live. Eleanor gave birth in a private wing of the palace, attended only by a doctor and nurse who were sworn to secrecy. The birth was never registered officially, and the child was immediately placed under my protection. For 15 years I have been raising Eleanor's child as my own, hidden from the world but loved and cared for within the safety of these walls. Thomas struggled to process the magnitude of what he was being told. But how? How could a child be hidden within the palace for 15 years? Surely others would have noticed? Catherine smiled for the first time since their conversation began. You would be surprised how easy it is to hide someone within an institution as large and complex as the royal household, especially when that person is officially documented as belonging there. Eleanor's child has been raised as my ward, a distant relative being educated privately within the palace. The staff who know believe the child to be an orphaned cousin from a minor branch of the family tree. And the child knows the truth? The child knows that I am not the biological mother, yes, but the full truth about Eleanor has been shared only gradually as maturity and understanding have developed. Eleanor's child knows about the journal, knows about the nursery, and has spent many hours in that room learning about the woman who gave her life to ensure the child's safety. The use of the feminine pronoun was not lost on Thomas. Her? Eleanor's daughter. Her name is Alexandra, though she has been known by other names for security purposes. She is now 15 years old, intelligent, compassionate, and bears a striking resemblance to her mother. She attends classes with private tutors, enjoys art and literature, and dreams of someday traveling the world and making a difference in people's lives. Thomas sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the human dimensions of the secret he had uncovered. This was not just a political conspiracy or a royal scandal, but a story of a mother's love and sacrifice, and of a woman who had dedicated 15 years of her life to honoring a promise made to her dying sister-in-law. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Surely the safer course would be to deny everything and have me transferred or dismissed. Catherine returned to her chair and looked at Thomas with an expression that mixed sadness and resolve. "Because the situation has become more complicated than we ever anticipated. Alexandra is now 15 years old, and she is beginning to ask questions about her future that I cannot answer without revealing more of the truth. She wants to know why she cannot leave the palace grounds unescorted, why she cannot attend school with other children her age, and why her existence must be kept secret from the world." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "More importantly, there are forces within the royal establishment that have never stopped viewing Alexandra as a potential threat. As she grows older and her resemblance to Eleanor becomes more pronounced, the risk of discovery increases, and with it the danger to her safety and to all of us who have been protecting her." Thomas began to understand the broader implications of his discovery. "You need help." "I need more than help, Thomas. I need someone I can trust completely, someone who is not part of the inner circle of palace politics, someone who discovered this secret through innocent curiosity rather than malicious intent. Your background check shows that you are a man of integrity, with no political ambitions and no connections to the factions within the royal household that might use this information for their own purposes." The offer, though not yet explicitly stated, hung in the air between them. Catherine was not just explaining the situation to him, she was recruiting him to become part of it. Thomas realized that his life was about to change in ways he could never have anticipated when he found that brass key hidden behind the picture frame. "What would you need me to do?" he asked. "Help me protect her," Catherine said simply. "Help me find a way to give Alexandra the life her mother died to secure for her, while keeping her safe from those who would use her existence to destabilize everything Eleanor died to protect. It will not be easy, and it will require you to make sacrifices and take risks that go far beyond your duties as a palace guard." Thomas thought of Eleanor's journal, of the photographs showing a child growing up in shadows, and of the woman sitting across from him who had dedicated 15 years of her life to keeping a promise to the dead. He thought of Alexandra, a teenager who had never experienced the normal freedoms that others her age took for granted, and of the unknown forces that continued to pose a threat to her safety. "When do I start?" he asked. Catherine smiled, and for the first time in their conversation, Thomas saw relief in her expression. "You already have," she said. "The moment you opened that door, you became part of this story. The question now is how we write the next chapter." As the morning sun rose fully over Kensington Palace, Thomas Mitchell realized that his life as a simple security guard was over. He was now a guardian of secrets that could reshape the monarchy, a protector of a girl whose very existence was both a miracle and a threat, and a participant in a conspiracy of love that had already lasted 15 years and showed no signs of ending. The sealed nursery had given up more of its secrets, but the most important revelation was yet to come. Somewhere within the palace walls, Alexandra was beginning another day of her hidden life, unaware that the circle of people protecting her had just grown by one, and that the discovery of her existence by an honest guard might be the first step toward the freedom her mother had died hoping she would someday achieve. 3 days after his conversation with Catherine, Thomas found himself standing outside a door he had passed countless times but never really noticed. It was located in the palace's private residential wing, unmarked and seemingly ordinary, but Catherine had told him this was where he would find Alexandra. His role as her new protection detail would begin with a simple introduction, but Thomas knew that nothing about this situation would remain simple for long. He knocked softly and heard a young voice call for him to enter. The room beyond was larger than he had expected, decorated in soft blues and greens with tall windows that looked out over the palace's private gardens. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that ranged from classic literature to modern science texts, while a comfortable seating area occupied the center of the space. Near the windows, an easel held a half-finished oil painting of the garden scene outside. Alexandra was sitting at a writing desk, a notebook open before her and a pen poised in her hand. When she looked up at Thomas's entrance, he was immediately struck by her resemblance to Eleanor. The girl had the same bright, intelligent eyes, the same gentle curve to her mouth, and the same graceful bearing that had made her mother so beloved by the public. But there was something else in Alexandra's expression, a wariness that spoke of a life lived always looking over one's shoulder. "You must be Thomas," she said, rising and offering a slight curtsy that was perfectly executed despite its informality. "Catherine told me you would be joining our little conspiracy." Her directness surprised him, as did the maturity in her voice. This was not a child who had been sheltered from the realities of her situation, but a young woman who understood exactly what her existence meant and what dangers it represented. Thomas offered a respectful bow in return. "It's an honor to meet you, Your Highness," he said, then paused, "though I'm not certain what the proper form of address should be." Alexandra smiled, and the expression transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely radiant. "Just Alexandra, please. I've never been acknowledged officially, so the titles don't really apply. Besides, I think formality would get rather tiresome if you're going to be spending time around here." She gestured for him to take a seat in one of the comfortable chairs near her desk. "Catherine says you found my mother's nursery." That must have been quite a shock. Thomas nodded, still adjusting to the surreal nature of the conversation. "I had no idea what I was walking into. The room was so perfectly preserved, so full of love and care. When I read your mother's journal, I began to understand the sacrifices that have been made to keep you safe." Alexandra's expression grew more serious. "I've read that journal many times over the years. Sometimes I go to the nursery just to sit in the chair where my mother used to plan for my future. It helps me feel connected to her, even though I never really knew her." "Catherine has told you about her?" "Everything she could remember, plus stories from others who knew her. I know about her charity work, her love of music, her terrible sense of direction, and her habit of crying during sad movies. Catherine has made sure I understand who my mother was as a person, not just as a princess." Alexandra moved to the window, looking out at the gardens with an expression that Thomas was beginning to recognize as characteristic, a mixture of longing and resignation. But knowing about her and knowing her are different things. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if she had lived, if I could have grown up normally instead of in this beautiful prison." The honesty of her statement caught Thomas off guard. "Do you feel imprisoned here?" "Not by Catherine or the people who care for me," Alexandra said quickly. "They've given me everything they could within the constraints of the situation. I've had excellent tutors, access to the palace's incredible library, art supplies, music lessons, and all the material comforts anyone could want. But I've never been to a regular school, never had friends my own age, never gone to a movie theater or a shopping mall or any of the places that other teenagers take for granted." She turned back to face him, and Thomas saw a depth of understanding in her eyes that seemed far beyond her 15 years. "I know why these restrictions exist. Catherine has explained the political realities, the threats from people who would use my existence for their own purposes, and the need to protect not just me but everyone who has been involved in keeping me safe. I understand the logic, but understanding doesn't make the isolation any easier to bear." Thomas felt a surge of sympathy for the girl. She had been born into a situation not of her making, raised with love, but also with constraints that would have broken many people. Yet here she was, articulate, thoughtful, and seemingly well-adjusted despite circumstances that would have challenged anyone. Catherine mentioned that you've been asking more questions lately about your future. Alexandra nodded. I'm 15 now, and I can't stay hidden forever. In 3 years, I'll be an adult, at least legally, and I'll need to make decisions about what kind of life I want to live. But how can I make those decisions when I don't even know what options are available to me? She moved to one of her bookshelves and pulled out a thick volume about international universities. I've been reading about colleges in different countries, about careers I might pursue, about ways I might be able to make a difference in the world. But every plan I make comes up against the same obstacle. How do I live a normal life when my very existence is a state secret? Thomas was beginning to understand why Catherine had been so concerned about Alexandra's growing restlessness. The girl was at an age where the desire for independence and normal experiences was natural and healthy, but her circumstances made such desires extremely dangerous to pursue. Have you and Catherine discussed possible solutions? I could be given a completely new identity and relocated somewhere far from England, but that would mean leaving behind everyone I've ever known and loved, including Catherine. I could continue to live here indefinitely, but that means accepting that I'll never have a normal relationship, never marry, never have children of my own, never contribute to society in any meaningful way.
Alexandra sat down across from Thomas, her expression growing more animated as she continued.
There's a third option that Catherine and I have discussed, but it's the most dangerous one. I could reveal my existence to the world, claim my rightful place in the royal family, and trust that public support would protect me from whatever threats led to my concealment in the first place. The idea sent a chill through Thomas as he considered the implications. That would certainly be dangerous. Extremely dangerous, Alexandra agreed. But it might also be the only way to honor my mother's memory and live the life she died to give me. She didn't sacrifice herself just so I could exist in shadows forever. She wanted me to have a future, to be free to make my own choices and follow my own dreams. As they talked, Thomas found himself impressed not just by Alexandra's intelligence and maturity, but by her genuine goodness. Despite the extraordinary circumstances of her life, she had developed into a young woman who thought about others before herself, who understood the complexities of her situation, and who was willing to consider difficult choices for the right reasons. Catherine says you're going to help protect me, Alexandra said, changing the subject. What does that mean exactly? Thomas realized he didn't have a complete answer to her question. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure yet. Catherine and I are still working out the details. But I think it means helping to ensure your safety while also helping to find a way forward that gives you the life you deserve. And what do you think I deserve? The question was asked with genuine curiosity, not as a test, but Thomas felt the weight of it nonetheless. I think you deserve the same things any young person deserves. The chance to discover who you are, to pursue your dreams, to form relationships, to make mistakes and learn from them, and to contribute something meaningful to the world. The circumstances of your birth don't diminish your right to those experiences. Alexandra smiled, and Thomas saw tears forming in her eyes. Thank you for saying that. Sometimes I worry that I'm being selfish by wanting more than what I have, especially when so many people have sacrificed so much to keep me safe.
Wanting a life isn't selfish, Thomas said firmly.
Your mother died to give you that right, and the people who have protected you all these years did so because they wanted you to have a future, not just survival. Over the next 2 hours, Alexandra showed Thomas around her living space, introduced him to her tutors, and shared some of her artwork and writing. He learned that she spoke 4 languages fluently, had a particular talent for oil painting, and wrote poetry that showed a wisdom and emotional depth remarkable for someone her age. She was also, he discovered, an accomplished pianist who often played in the evening hours when the palace was quiet. As their time together drew to a close, Alexandra walked with Thomas to the door of her suite. I want you to know, she said, that I appreciate what you're doing even though I know you didn't ask for any of this when you found that key. "None of us asked for this situation," Thomas replied. "But now that we're all part of it, we need to work together to find the best possible outcome for everyone involved, especially for you. I have a request if you're willing to consider it." "Of course. I'd like you to help me visit the nursery again. I go there sometimes when Catherine is available to accompany me, but it's been several months since my last visit. Being in that room helps me feel closer to my mother, and I think having you there, someone who discovered it independently and can see it with fresh eyes, might help me understand it in a new way." Thomas agreed, and they arranged to visit the nursery together the following day. As he left Alexandra's suite and made his way back through the palace corridors, Thomas reflected on how much his life had changed in less than a week. He had gone from being a security guard with routine responsibilities to being a guardian of state secrets and a protector of a girl whose very existence challenged the foundations of the monarchy. But more than that, he had met someone whose courage and grace in the face of extraordinary circumstances had impressed and inspired him. Alexandra was not just a political problem to be managed or a secret to be kept, but a remarkable young woman who deserved the chance to live up to her considerable potential. The conversation had also clarified something important for Thomas. The solution to Alexandra's situation would not be found in maintaining the status quo indefinitely. The girl was too intelligent, too spirited, and too fundamentally good to be content with a life lived entirely in shadows. Catherine had been right to be concerned about the future, because change was coming whether they planned for it or not. The question was whether they could guide that change in a direction that protected everyone involved while giving Alexandra the life her mother had died to secure for her. As Thomas made his way home that evening, he knew that the sealed nursery had revealed its most important secret of all, not just that Eleanor's child had survived, but that she had grown into someone worth all the risks they had taken and all the challenges that lay ahead. The next phase of the conspiracy would require more than just maintaining secrets. It would require them to find a way to transform those secrets into a future that honored both Eleanor's sacrifice and Alexandra's dreams, no matter how dangerous that transformation might prove to be. The return visit to the nursery took place on a gray Thursday morning when most of the palace staff were occupied with preparations for an upcoming state dinner. Thomas met Alexandra at the entrance to the East Wing, and together they made their way through the quiet corridors to the door that had changed everything. As Alexandra unlocked the room with the brass key that Catherine had entrusted to her years ago, Thomas noticed the reverent way she handled both the key and the door, as if she were entering a sacred space. The nursery looked exactly as Thomas remembered it, but Alexandra's presence transformed his understanding of the room entirely. Where he had initially seen evidence of a conspiracy, he now saw a shrine to maternal love. Where he had found clues to a political secret, he now witnessed a daughter's connection to the mother she had never known. Alexandra moved through the space with familiarity, touching objects with the casual intimacy of someone returning home after a long absence. "I used to spend hours in here when I was younger," Alexandra said, settling into the armchair beside the crib. "Catherine would bring me here on my birthday every year, and we would look through my mother's journal together. She would tell me stories about what my mother was thinking when she wrote each entry and help me understand the love behind the words." Alexandra opened the leather-bound journal to a page that was clearly one of her favorites, marked with a small ribbon. "This entry was written when my mother was 7 months pregnant. She talks about feeling me move for the first time and wondering what kind of person I would become. She wrote that she hoped I would be brave enough to stand up for what was right, but wise enough to know when fighting would do more harm than good." Thomas listened as Alexandra read several passages from the journal, her voice taking on some of the same gentle cadence that he remembered from Eleanor's public speeches. The resemblance between mother and daughter was striking. Not just in appearance, but in the way they both seemed to carry themselves with grace while harboring deep concerns about the world around them. "The hardest part," Alexandra continued, "is reading about all the plans she made for my future, plans that never came to pass because of the threats she discovered. She wrote about teaching me to ride horses, about traveling with me to see the charity work she was supporting, about the schools she wanted me to attend, and the experiences she hoped we would share." Alexandra closed the journal and moved to the wardrobe, pulling out one of the smaller outfits that had been carefully preserved. Catherine told me that my mother chose every piece of clothing in here herself. She spent days shopping for things I would need as I grew up, trying to imagine what I would look like at different ages and what kinds of clothes would suit my personality. The poignancy of the moment was not lost on Thomas. Here was a young woman holding a dress that had been chosen for her by a mother who died before they could ever meet, in a room that had been maintained for 15 years as a testament to love and loss. The political implications of Alexandra's existence seemed secondary to the human story playing out before him. "Alexandra," Thomas said carefully, "have you ever resented the choices that were made for you? The fact that you were hidden away instead of being allowed to grow up in the normal world?" Alexandra considered the question seriously before answering. "I've thought about that a lot, especially lately. I think there have been times when I felt angry about missing out on normal childhood experiences, but I've never resented my mother's decision or Catherine's role in implementing it. When I read these journal entries and understand the genuine threats that existed, I know that they did what they thought was best to protect me." She moved to the window and looked out at a view of the palace gardens that was partially obscured by the room's position in a secluded wing. "But I do think the time for hiding is coming to an end. I'm old enough now to understand the risks and make informed decisions about my own life. And I think my mother would want me to be brave enough to step out of the shadows when the time was right." Thomas joined her at the window. "What do you think stepping out of the shadows would look like?" "I've been giving that a lot of thought lately," Alexandra said. "The most dramatic option would be to reveal everything publicly, hold a press conference, tell the world who I am, and let the chips fall where they may. But that would put Catherine and everyone else who has protected me at risk, and it might also backfire if the public doesn't believe the story or if it creates the kind of political instability that my mother was trying to prevent." She turned away from the window and began examining the photographs on the small table beside the crib. A more gradual approach might be safer. "I could start by revealing myself to select members of the royal family, people who have the power to offer protection and legitimacy. If I could gain their support, it might be possible to emerge publicly with their backing rather than as a threat to the establishment." Thomas was impressed by the strategic thinking behind Alexandra's analysis, but he was also concerned about the naivety implicit in some of her assumptions. "Do you think the royal family members who posed a threat 15 years ago are no longer in positions of power? That's what worries me," Alexandra admitted. "Catherine has been careful not to tell me too much about the specific individuals who were involved in the original conspiracy against my mother, partly to protect me and partly because she doesn't want to prejudice me against people I might need to work with someday. But I know that some of those people are still alive and still influential within the royal establishment." Alexandra picked up one of the photographs showing her as a young child and studied it with an expression that mixed fondness and sadness. "Sometimes I wonder if my mother would recognize me now. In her journal, she wrote about hoping I would grow up to be kind and strong and committed to helping others. I think I've become those things, but I've also become someone who has learned to live with secrets and caution and constant awareness of danger. Those weren't qualities she wanted me to develop." Thomas realized that this conversation was approaching the heart of the dilemma that had been troubling Catherine. Alexandra was reaching an age where continued concealment was becoming psychologically damaging, but revelation remained physically dangerous. The girl needed a path forward that honored both her mother's sacrifice and her own legitimate desire for a real life. "There might be another option," Thomas said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "What if we could find a way to test the waters without full revelation? To gauge how the current royal establishment would react to your existence before committing to a specific course of action?" Alexandra turned to face him with renewed interest. "What do you mean?" "I'm still working out the details in my mind," Thomas said. "But what if we could arrange for you to meet some key members of the royal family in an unofficial capacity? Not as Eleanor's hidden daughter making a claim to recognition, but as Catherine's ward who happens to bear a striking resemblance to the late princess. We could observe their reactions, assess whether they pose a threat, and determine who might be potential allies." The idea clearly appealed to Alexandra, who began pacing the small room as she thought through the implications. That could work, but it would require Catherine's cooperation, and I'm not sure she would be comfortable with even that level of risk. Catherine is already concerned about your growing restlessness, Thomas pointed out. She knows that the current situation can't continue indefinitely. If we could present her with a plan that offered a controlled way of testing the possibilities, she might be willing to consider it. Alexandra's eyes lit up with excitement for the first time since Thomas had met her. There's a charity gala next month that Catherine always attends. It's one of the few royal events that includes a broader mix of people, not just the immediate family, but also extended relatives, close family friends, and major supporters of royal charities. If I were to attend as Catherine's guest, I would be able to meet several key people without the encounter seeming staged or significant. Thomas could see the appeal of the plan, but he was also aware of its dangers. The resemblance to your mother might trigger recognition. It might, Alexandra agreed, but that could also work in our favor. If people notice the resemblance but don't know who I am, their reactions might tell us a lot about their feelings toward my mother and their likely response to learning about me. And if someone does recognize who I must be, we would learn immediately whether they pose a threat or might be willing to help. As they continued to discuss the possibilities, Thomas found himself caught up in Alexandra's enthusiasm despite his awareness of the risks involved. The girl had been confined for too long, and her need for some kind of forward movement was palpable. More importantly, her analysis of the situation was sound, and her proposed approach was more thoughtful than anything Thomas might have suggested. We would need to prepare you for the possibility that the evening could go very wrong very quickly, Thomas warned. I understand that, Alexandra said seriously, but I also understand that living my entire life in fear of what might happen isn't really living at all. My mother took enormous risks to give me a chance at a real future. I think she would want me to be brave enough to take some calculated risks of my own when the time came. They spent another hour in the nursery, looking through more of Eleanor's belongings and discussing potential scenarios for the charity gala. By the time they prepared to leave, Thomas felt that he had witnessed something significant. Alexandra had moved from being a passive recipient of other people's protection to being an active participant in planning her own future. The girl was ready to emerge from the shadows, and the only question was whether the adults in her life would be wise enough to help her do it safely. As they locked the nursery door behind them, Alexandra turned to Thomas with a smile that reminded him strongly of her mother's famous warmth. Thank you for listening to me and taking my ideas seriously. For 15 years, the adults in my life have made decisions about me based on what they thought was best. You're the first person who has asked me what I think would be best for myself. Thomas realized that this conversation had marked a turning point in more ways than one. Alexandra was no longer the hidden child who needed protection from the world, but a young woman who was ready to engage with that world on her own terms. The sealed nursery had revealed its deepest secret. Not just that Eleanor's daughter had survived, but that she had grown into someone who possessed both her mother's compassion and a strength that was entirely her own. The next step would be convincing Catherine that the time for complete concealment had passed, and that Alexandra's emergence into the world was not just inevitable but necessary. The charity gala was still 3 weeks away, which would give them time to plan and prepare, but Thomas knew that they were moving toward a moment of truth that would change everything for all of them. As they walked back through the palace corridors, Thomas reflected on how the discovery of a brass key had led him to become part of a story that was still being written. The sealed nursery had kept its secrets for 15 years, but those secrets were finally ready to see the light of day, and everyone involved would need to be prepared for the consequences that would follow. The Royal Children's Foundation Charity Gala was held on the first Friday evening of November, in the Grand Ballroom of Kensington Palace. The event had been planned for months, bringing together members of the royal family, prominent supporters of children's charities, and carefully selected representatives from various humanitarian organizations. For Catherine, it was an annual obligation that she approached with professional grace but little personal enthusiasm. For Alexandra, it represented the most significant moment of her 15-year existence. Thomas positioned himself strategically throughout the evening. officially present as part of the expanded security detail but actually serving as Alexandra's silent guardian and observer. He watched as Catherine introduced her ward to various guests, presenting Alexandra as a distant relative who had been privately educated and was considering university studies in international relations. The cover story was plausible enough that most guests accepted it without question. But Thomas noticed that several people did double takes when they first saw Alexandra, clearly struck by her resemblance to someone they couldn't quite place. Alexandra herself moved through the evening with remarkable composure, engaging in conversations about her supposed studies and her interest in charitable work with a poise that would have impressed anyone who didn't know her true circumstances. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, studying the backgrounds of the people she was likely to meet, and practicing responses to questions about her background that would be truthful without being revealing. The first significant encounter came when Catherine introduced Alexandra to Lord Pemberton, an elderly gentleman who had served as an advisor to the royal family for over 3 decades. Thomas watched from across the room as Pemberton's expression changed from polite interest to sharp recognition, his eyes widening as he looked more closely at Alexandra's face. "My dear," Lord Pemberton said to Catherine, his voice carefully controlled, "your ward bears a most striking resemblance to someone I once knew very well." Catherine's response was equally careful. People often comment on family resemblances, even distant ones. Alexandra comes from a branch of the family that has always maintained a strong physical type, but Lord Pemberton was not easily deflected. He engaged Alexandra in conversation about her interests and her plans for the future, asking questions that seemed innocent enough on the surface but were clearly designed to assess her intelligence, her knowledge of current events, and her understanding of royal protocols. Throughout the exchange, his eyes never left her face, and Thomas could see the man's mind working to solve a puzzle that had suddenly presented itself. The conversation ended cordially enough, but as Lord Pemberton moved away, Thomas saw him approach several other elderly guests, engaging them in whispered conversations that involved frequent glances back toward Alexandra. Word was spreading among the older generation of royal watchers, people who had known Eleanor personally and could not help but recognize her features in her daughter's face. The second crucial encounter occurred when Prince Edward, Catherine's brother-in-law and a senior member of the royal family, arrived fashionably late to the gala. Thomas had been particularly concerned about this meeting as Prince Edward had been mentioned obliquely in Eleanor's journal as someone who had not supported her during her final months. As Catherine made the introduction, Thomas moved closer to observe the prince's reaction. Prince Edward's response to meeting Alexandra was immediate and unmistakable. His face went pale, and he actually took a step backward as if he had seen a ghost. The resemblance to Eleanor was clearly not lost on him, and unlike Lord Pemberton's careful curiosity, the prince's reaction suggested something closer to alarm. "Catherine," Prince Edward said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "might I have a word with you privately?" Catherine excused herself and Alexandra with practiced grace, but Thomas could see the tension in her posture as she followed the prince to a quieter corner of the ballroom. Their conversation was brief but intense, with Prince Edward gesturing occasionally toward Alexandra and Catherine responding with quiet but firm responses. When they returned, the prince's demeanor had shifted from alarm to something more calculating, and he spent several more minutes talking with Alexandra, asking questions about her background that were more pointed than those posed by other guests. As the evening progressed, Thomas observed several other significant reactions. Lady Margaret Thornbury, Eleanor's former lady-in-waiting, actually gasped when she first saw Alexandra and spent the rest of the evening hovering nearby, her eyes filled with tears and her expression a mixture of joy and disbelief. Sir James Whitfield, who had served as Eleanor's private secretary, excused himself shortly after being introduced to Alexandra and did not return to the gala, leaving Thomas to wonder whether he had left to make phone calls or simply because he could not handle the emotional impact of the encounter. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source. Princess Victoria, Catherine's youngest sister-in-law, and someone who had never met Eleanor personally, approached Alexandra midway through the evening with an expression of genuine warmth and interest. Their conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, covering topics from literature to international affairs, and Thomas could see that the two young women were genuinely connecting. "I hope you don't mind my saying so," Princess Victoria said as their conversation drew to a close. "But there's something about you that seems remarkably familiar. I feel as though I've been waiting to meet you for years, though I can't explain why." Alexandra's response was perfectly pitched. "Sometimes we meet people who feel like immediate friends. Perhaps that's what you're sensing." After Princess Victoria moved on to speak with other guests, Alexandra made her way to Thomas's position near the ballroom's main entrance. "We need to leave," she said quietly. "Soon." Thomas immediately became alert. "What's wrong?" "Prince Edward has been making phone calls. I saw him step outside onto the terrace twice, and both times he was speaking urgently to someone. After the second call, he spoke with Lord Pemberton and two other gentlemen I don't recognize. They've been watching me ever since." Thomas looked across the ballroom and confirmed Alexandra's observation. A small group of older men had positioned themselves with clear sightlines to Alexandra's location, and their body language suggested they were not merely socializing but conducting some form of surveillance. "Catherine needs to know," Thomas said. "I've already signaled her. She's making our excuses to the hosts now." As if summoned by their conversation, Catherine appeared at Alexandra's side with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm afraid we need to leave early this evening," she announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Alexandra has an early tutorial session tomorrow morning." Their exit from the gala was accomplished smoothly, but Thomas noticed that several guests watched their departure with expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern. As they made their way through the palace corridors toward Catherine's private apartment, none of them spoke, but the tension was palpable. Once they were safely behind closed doors, Catherine turned to Alexandra with an expression that mixed pride and worry. "How do you think it went?" "Better and worse than we hoped," Alexandra replied honestly. "Princess Victoria was wonderful, warm, genuine, and clearly someone who could become an ally if she knew the truth. Lady Margaret recognized me immediately and seemed overjoyed rather than threatened. But Prince Edward was alarmed from the moment he saw me, and he's clearly been sharing his concerns with others." Thomas added his observations about the phone calls and the impromptu surveillance group, confirming that the evening had indeed raised alarm bells among certain members of the royal establishment. "The question now," he said, "is what they plan to do with their suspicions." Catherine moved to her window, looking out at the palace grounds with an expression that Thomas had learned to recognize as her thinking face. "We always knew that this moment would come eventually," she said finally. "The question was whether we would be the ones to choose the timing and circumstances, or whether events would force our hand." She turned back to face them. "I think tonight's reactions tell us that we're rapidly approaching a point where continued concealment will become impossible. Too many people now suspect the truth, and secrets this significant have a way of coming out regardless of our efforts to contain them." Alexandra sat down heavily in one of Catherine's armchairs, the adrenaline of the evening finally giving way to exhaustion. "So what do we do now?" "Now we accelerate our timeline," Catherine said decisively. "We can't afford to wait and see what Prince Edward and his allies might do with their suspicions. We need to take control of the situation before they do." Thomas felt a chill of anticipation mixed with fear. "What does that mean?" Catherine looked at both of them with an expression that was equal parts determination and sorrow. "It means we prepare to tell the world the truth about Eleanor's daughter. All of it. The secret pregnancy, the threats that led to the concealment, the 15 years of hidden protection, and Alexandra's right to take her place as Eleanor's legitimate heir." The magnitude of what Catherine was proposing hit Thomas like a physical blow. They were talking about revealing a secret that could destabilize the monarchy, challenge the line of succession, and expose everyone involved to unknown consequences. But as he looked at Alexandra, sitting in her mother's former home and preparing to claim her birthright, Thomas realized that this moment had always been inevitable. "When?" Alexandra asked, her voice steady despite the enormity of what they were contemplating. "Soon. Catherine replied. "We'll need a few weeks to prepare properly, to gather legal documentation, and to reach out to potential allies within the government and the press. But it has to be soon, before Prince Edward and his faction can organize any kind of response that might put you in danger." Alexandra nodded slowly. "My mother died to give me the chance to live freely and claim my rightful place in the world. I think she would want me to be brave enough to take that chance, regardless of the risks." Thomas looked around Catherine's elegant sitting room and thought about the brass key that had started this entire adventure. In finding that key and opening the sealed nursery, he had unleashed forces that were now moving toward their inevitable conclusion. Alexandra would emerge from the shadows that had protected her for 15 years, and the world would learn that Eleanor's love story had not ended with her death, but had continued in the form of a daughter who carried her mother's courage and compassion. The sealed nursery had given up all of its secrets now, but those secrets were about to become the foundation for a new chapter in royal history. As Thomas looked at Alexandra, he saw not the hidden child she had been, but the remarkable woman she was becoming, someone worthy of the sacrifices that had been made to protect her, and strong enough to honor her mother's memory by living the life Eleanor had died to secure for her. The conspiracy of love that had lasted 15 years was about to transform into something far more significant, a revelation that would change the royal family forever, and a young woman's emergence into a world that had been waiting for her return without even knowing it. The sealed nursery would remain as a shrine to Eleanor's memory, but Alexandra would no longer need its protection. She was ready to step into the light and claim her inheritance as her mother's daughter and her own person. The future remained uncertain, filled with risks and challenges that none of them could fully anticipate. But as Thomas watched Alexandra and Catherine begin to plan for the revelation that would change everything, he knew that they were finally moving in the direction that Eleanor's sacrifice had always been intended to make possible. The sealed nursery had kept its promise, and now it was time for the world to learn about the miracle it had protected for so many years.